Hello, listener, and welcome to Book 2, Chapter 1 of Bite-Sized Tales, the audio flash fiction podcast. This week's chapter is a bonus chapter consisting of stories from all three authors, unified by a single writing prompt.
Montgomery. Written and read by Dot Moore. Breathe. Faster, Monty, faster. Her weight adjusted and I exhaled hard. She leaned forward, patting that spot along my neck she knows I like. Attaboy, Monty, faster. My hooves beat against the dirt path through the slot canyon and I focused forward to avoid brushing against the high-walled sandstone crevasse. Flashes of sunlight beamed through the breaks in the rock overhead. I shook my head through a stride as the hot desert air whipped through my mane. Each gallop was followed by a huffed breath as we wove through the narrow rock walls. We broke through the passage. The wide openness of the canyons took shape around us. Steep cliff sides curved upwards like a bowl beneath the heavens. To my left, my mare Rosie met my pace. She raced alongside me, her rider edging her ahead. A challenge. I let out a snort and pushed forward, rebuilding the distance between us. I heard Rosie's rider, Dale, shout from behind me. My rider, Lottie, let out a loud holler as I sped ahead in triumph, and we rounded west towards the early sunset. The rest of our band of outsiders followed suit, with the herd barreling through the valley. It was Lottie's idea to hide out in the canyons. Dale thought she couldn't manage corralling the cattle through the narrows, but sure as the sunrise, my girl pulled through. It's been nearly 2 moons since we rustled up with the cattle. We've lost a few along the way, but that's the price you pay herding west. Now, I know there's little to be said regarding character amongst a corral of stallions like myself, but the truth of it is, Lottie and me didn't start out rustling. I spent my foal months on a ranch nestled along the town on the east side of the big river. That's where I met my Lottie. She raised me, groomed me, loved me as any little girl could love the wild-willed nature of a colt. Her ma and pa led a humble life, just the 3 of them, taking care of each other and their farm. But like most beautiful things in this world, there's always someone or something that comes along to burn it all to the ground. Our herd wasn't large by any means, but substantial enough to garner the attention of a few rogue cowpokes traveling upriver to head west. I'd been pacing the perimeter of our land where the sticker bushes were thickest when I heard them rustling through the fence line. I tried to bolt for the barn to warn Lottie, but they caught me. They tied me to the post at the far edge of the farm, and I watched as the once inviting warmth of the barn became engulfed in flames, the heat no longer a comfort to me. I only wanted to make sure Lottie was all right, so I yanked and kicked at the post trying to escape, and finally managed to loosen it enough to untie the rope. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me towards the blazing structure to try and find my Lottie. And there she was. Tear-stained cheeks and soot marks all across her dress, standing before the crumpled figures of Ma and Pa at the threshold of the house door. She sobbed softly, and I pressed my nose into the middle of her back, for comfort, for support. She turned around and wrapped her arms around my neck, and I dipped my head to cradle her against me. My Lottie, safe with me, but still so hurt. She sobbed, and I could feel her tears wet against my coat. I let out a low huff through my nostrils and pulled her in again with a squeeze. Lottie pushed against me and moved to look directly into my eyes. She lowered her forehead to meet mine as she whispered, "We're going to get 'em back. Monty, you gotta help me get 'em back." The fierceness in her gaze told me everything I needed to know, that my once gentle little girl was now hardened by the harshest of realities, and it was entirely up to me to keep her safe. In those early years, many fell prey to the charms of an orphaned little girl and her loyal steed. We were an unsuspecting duo that over time, with selective inclusion, grew to our current band of misfits and wanderers. Lottie calls us foundlings, I guess because we've all found each other over the years, but I still say we're more like a bunch of strays that managed to talk our way out of a fight. It's been 8 moons now since the last girl joined up. Morgan's her name, if I remember. We've had many come and go over the years. That's Lottie's first rule. You stay as long as you like and as long as you need. We work together to provide for each other. No one for themselves. So far, it's worked beautifully for us. Lottie genuinely cares for her found family, but her priorities haven't changed, and neither have mine. It was only coincidence when we stumbled across the rustlers that torched her family farm. Luckily for them, most of the cattle was still living. A small token of repayment for Lottie's loss, but nonetheless her rightful property. And that's how it started. So you see, it's not really my fault. I don't know if it's guilt or worry that makes me entertain that thought, but in the end it was Lottie that got us here. Her determination for vengeance had fueled her for far too long, but the beauty of this world around us has brought a new light to her eyes. That hatred, that rage within her is stifled when we ride across the countryside. This one was fun to write. I initially planned on writing from the perspective of Lottie and what her experience was like going through all of this, and how her perception of being a rustler may have impacted her life and the choice that she made, searching for vengeance instead of just trying to make the most of the life that she was given. And then I completely flipped it on its head and said, you know what, I'm going to write from the perspective of a horse. And I think that it turned out great. The other fun little nugget about this chapter, these stories, is that we were gifted a line or a prompt phrase, I guess you could say, from our wonderful listener and friend Pete, and that's how it started. So you see, it's not really my fault. That line, you'll find that in all of our stories this week. So something to keep an eye out for, or an ear out for, rather.
Mundane. Written and read by Wayne Cole. And that's how it started. So you see, it's really not my fault. I just stood there staring at the goblin incredulously. They always seem to have an excuse for everything, but this one really took the cake. I glanced down at my notes only to realize that I'd stopped taking them by the goblin's second sentence. Okay, let's see if I can get this straight. Mr. Gobo. Okay, Mr. Gobo. No, mister, just Gobo. One-word name, like Prince, Madonna, or Fabio. Yeah, especially like Fabio. People say I look like him. I bit down my initial sarcastic response to ask if these people were blind. Even for a goblin, this one was frustrating, and it was bringing out my less than professional side. Okay, Gobo, you created a game. Yeah, Mundane, the role-playing game. Well, it's really just a LARP for now. I'm gonna release rules for playing it either way, though. Anyway, you were playtesting this game at a diner with 3 goblins, 2 dryads, and an ogre. You don't think maybe that was a bad idea? Which part? Taking an ogre into a mundane restaurant surrounded by people who don't know about magical beings. Oh, no, not at all. Grimm's a great role player. Really gets into character. Of course, he does usually play barbarians. Maybe a 3rd level accountant might have been a bit much for him. When I focused on the goblin after shaking my head, I noticed he had a clipboard and was taking notes. I had no idea where the clipboard had come from until I glanced down and realized that mine was gone. Hey, give that back, I yelled as I grabbed the clipboard out of his hands. The sheet was filled with game mechanics and playtest ideas. I ripped the top sheet off and handed it to him. Thanks, this is good stuff. Say, you wouldn't want to do some playtesting, would you? No, I don't want to play test. Can we please try to focus here? Let's get back to the ogre. Grim! Yes, Grim. You brought Grim into a mundane coffee shop, pretending to be a human accountant. But his glamour made him look like Lou Ferrigno. None of you thought that might draw a little unwanted attention to yourself? Gobo looked up for a moment like he was actually considering the question. No. I shook my head and let out an exasperated sigh. Why didn't you realize that looking like a celebrity in public would draw attention? 'Cause only Grim knew who Lou Ferrigno was? Plus, no one expects to see a celebrity in a random diner in Oklahoma. Spiffy went as Britney Spears once and nobody noticed. Who's Spiffy? No, wait, don't answer that. Please, just go on with your story. So, there we were, gathered around the table, talking about spreadsheets and the big sports ball game the night before. All really getting into our roles, right? I mean, I was really ranting about dumb referees and how the losing team got robbed. Real top-tier role-playing, if I do say so myself. And I just did. Grim was waving his arms wildly because his character liked the other team. Hitting the waitress was totally an accident. I made a few notes and then asked. So, Grim threw the first punch, but it was an accident. Well, that's technically right. And technically is the best kind of right. It sent a hot coffee flying and onto some college jerk. Well, turns out the game we were improvising about was an awful lot like the one that he had lost the night before. He was already angry because of, what we'd said and all, and that was the last straw. Say, do you know where that saying comes from? Like, there was no straw here because it was coffee. Please, just focus on the story or we'll be here all day. Grim is totally the best LARPer in the group. Even though he barely felt this guy's punch, he totally played it up. Went flying through the air, smashed into a table. Didn't look realistic at all, but the point is, he committed. It wasn't his fault the table had ordered the cast iron breakfast extravaganza. I could smell his skin burning from across the room. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. His glamour failed from the pain, and he turned full ogre in the middle of the restaurant. Well, not exactly. See, the glamour only partially failed. What do you mean partially? What part? The skin color. He held on to the face, but his skin turned green. He also kind of grew a bit, so most of his clothes, all ripped off. He still looked like the Lou Ferrigno guy, but a big green version of him. And he was roaring and throwing things around in pain. He jumped up on my table and did an impression of the roaring and stomping. Any other day, I might have found it amusing. Sit down, please. He sat down, but he looked pleased with himself for the act. While this was happening, what were you doing to try to calm it down? Oh, I didn't break character at all. What would any mundane human do in that situation? I pulled out my cell phone and recorded the whole thing. I was up to 12,000 views before you brought me in. You recorded and uploaded this disaster? Yeah, you want to see? I suppose I better. Load up the video while I go get something for this headache that you've given me. I stepped out of the room into the hallway and let out a sound of extreme exasperation. Before I could take 2 steps, though, I found my partner waiting for me. I could tell by the expression on his face that I was not going to be happy with what he had to say. Word from the chief, we're letting him go, and doing our best to bury this. What? Why in the world would we do that? This guy has done more to expose the paranormal than the History Channel has in the past few years. He needs to be locked away for all of our own good. Sorry, man. What can I say? Chief's a role player. This guy's the GM's brother. This story, like the other two on the episode, comes from a prompt that one of the listeners gave us. I wasn't quite sure what to do with the prompt, but I found myself sitting in the waiting room while my wife was in the hospital, and as usual, I brought a notebook. I've found that some of my best writing has actually been in physical notebooks sitting around a hospital waiting. Some of the story comes from my own gaming group and an NPC that I created and have had a lot of fun with. That's certainly where the voice comes from. I'm very happy with this being my first story of our returning season for Bite-Sized Tales.
And that's how it started. So you see, it's not really my fault. Written and read by Chris Hussey. And that's how it started. So you see, it's not really my fault. Okay, so here's the deal. I know that you think you know how it started. I mean, most people do. But that's kind of how it is with people and big events. They see it happen, and their mind records their perception of the truth. Full audio, video, smell, and even touch if that falls into the equation. The point is, they don't really truly know. Everyone thinks they saw what they saw, but you know how that goes. You can always get someone in a group who all saw the same thing, see just one small difference, and then suddenly everyone actually didn't see the same thing. Didn't hear the same thing, didn't smell the same thing, or didn't touch the same thing, if that fell into the equation. And that's what we really have going on here. A lot of people were there. They saw it happen. But then when you go back and ask them, now it sounds like they all saw something different, heard something different, smelled something different, or even touched something different, if that fell into the equation. Everyone has a little different wrinkle, which makes the story of the whole really just a story with a bunch of different parts. Thankfully for you, I did see what happened. I heard it, I smelt it, and yeah, I even touched it. I had a front row seat to the whole damn thing, the entire experience, every detail as to who, what, where, why, and how it all went down. And if I remember correctly, I told you exactly that very fact not long after it happened. And this is where I start to have a problem. I'm there telling you that I know exactly what it was, exactly who it involved, exactly where it happened, and most importantly, why it happened. And instead of just listening to me, you have to go and ask everyone else. And that's why we are where we are right now. I mean, if you think about it, the time and trouble that would have been saved is pretty significant. I mean, there were a lot of people there, and you talked to them all before finally getting back around to me. Now, yes, of course, you could have gone and spoke to all of them after talking to me and getting a baseline established for what really went on. No one would certainly have stopped you. I mean, I wouldn't have stopped you. I know how important this is to you. But this is also very important to me. Now that this has happened, everything is going to change. I know that's a big statement to make, but it's true. Hell, even considering if you obtained the entire full account of what happened from everyone else, and I guess that is statistically possible considering the amount of people and the general odds that each will have at least one, if not two or three details absolutely correct, unlike me that has it at 100% correct. And this is where it becomes important to me. Which, when you think about it, doesn't really make you and I that different. You want it right, I want it right. We really are two of a kind. I respect you a lot for that, which I think is part of the reason why I stuck around after you did everything in reverse order. I knew what you were doing, and even though I didn't agree with the method, I knew you wouldn't stop until you had the full story, which of course, as we've already established, is what I have. So, what really happened? What really went down? Who started it, and then who responded, and how did it all escalate to become the ridiculous chain of events that it did? That last question, I think, is one that will be debated for quite some time. And I suppose, I will admit that despite knowing exactly what happened, I can only truly guess at the motivations for certain portions of it all. I mean, certainly some responses to some actions on the surface will seem pretty obvious. But when it comes to motivations, you may only really know the why of it all when you talk to those involved. And as you've likely thought already, that might be a little easier said than done. But don't worry, like we've already laid out, we're both here to get things exactly right. So when it comes to something like motivations, I will absolutely make certain to differentiate. Facts versus speculation. There's a big difference. Huge. And I think it's in that differentiation that it comes to the core of how this all started. The inability to effectively separate fact from speculation. One person says or does one thing, and the other thinks or interprets something else. It creates confusion, mistrust, anger, frustration, all of that. A huge web of negative emotions and thoughts and responses that leads to exactly what happened here today. And that's how it started. So you see, it's not really my fault. This story came from a listener-submitted prompt. Pete is his name. Thank you very much, Pete, for that. And we decided to all do a story based on that particular prompt. With my story, I've always wanted to write something where the protagonist goes on and on and on and talks around and about an issue, but by the time the story is done, we never actually find out what the issue is. I find that sort of thing incredibly amusing, pleasantly frustrating might be a good way to describe it. And with this particular prompt, I liked the symmetry of how now it becomes very much of a song that never ends sort of thing, where the first line and the last line of the story are exactly the same, and thus could cause a repeat and continuing cycle if one was to continue reading it, though I definitely wouldn't recommend doing so. I hope you enjoyed it. This chapter of Bite-Sized Tales has been brought to you under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Intro and outro music is Fantasy Motion by Alexander Nakarada, provided under Creative Commons 4.0 license. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd greatly appreciate reviews and recommendations to your friends. For more information about our authors, please visit bitesizedtales.com. We look forward to reading to you next time.